The shed still smells like it did when she was a girl, diesel and old rubber, cold dust and the faint mineral tang of rust that never quite leaves a place where iron has stood too long in Nebraska winters. She pulls the door along its bent track, the way her grandmother always did, with a shove of the shoulder rather than the hand, and the dusk light falls in a long gold bar across the concrete floor, landing square on the green flank of the tractor that has sat retired in the corner for going on 6 years now. The John Deere 4440 does not look like much in this light. The paint has gone chalky at the fenders, and the decals on the hood are cracked into a fine web, but the tires are still holding air, and someone, her grandmother she supposes, near the end, took the time to wipe the glass clean and drape a canvas tarp over the seat before shutting this place up for good. She lets her palm rest on the cowl, feels the cold of the metal seep through her skin, and stands there a moment the way people stand at a grave they have visited too rarely. It is 1,100 acres out there past the shed door, corn and soybean ground that has belonged to her family since 1968. Worked first by her grandmother's father-in-law, then by her grandmother alone for the better part of 4 decades, and now, this past year, by her. She is still learning the weight of that inheritance, not just the ground, but the machines that turned it, and the woman who kept them running long after men twice her size, in the seed caps at the co-op, said she had no business trying. On the workbench, beneath a coffee can full of dry rotted washers, she finds the binder. She has seen it before, as a child, always closed, always treated with a kind of hush she didn't understand then, a fat, oil-stained 3-ring binder, its cover long ago worn past any label, the pages inside gone soft and rippled from decades of shop-cold fingers. She sets it on the tractor's flat rear fender and opens it under the dying light, and the first page she lands on is not a receipt or a parts list, but a newspaper clipping, brittle as a dead leaf, the ink faded to sepia, dated a year she has only ever heard spoken of at kitchen tables, the year the whole county decided her grandmother had lost her mind for $600. She knows the shape of the story, the way you know a hymn before you can read the words. A bank auction, a auctioneer's warning, a tractor everyone swore was scrap. But she has never sat down with the proof of it, page by page, in her grandmother's own hand, and now, alone in the shed with the light going blue at the edges, she turns to the first entry and begins to read. The handwriting on the first page is small and square, the kind taught in one-room schoolhouses that no longer exist, and it does not waste words. October, hydraulic failure, case IH, 8,400 hours. Nothing more, no adjectives, as if the machine's death were a fact of weather rather than tragedy. But the granddaughter knows what those 4 words cost, because she has heard the rest of it filled in over the years by aunts and neighbors at funerals and fire pits, the way her grandmother had been running that case IH 1466 since before the granddaughter's mother was born. Since the tractor was still red enough to catch the sun, since the 1,100 acres of corn and soybean ground had been broken and drained and terraced by a husband and father-in-law who bought the place outright in 1968 with a GI loan and a stubbornness that apparently ran in the blood on both sides of the family. By the autumn in question, her grandmother was 58 years old and had been the sole operator of that ground for 11 years, since her husband's heart gave out in a soybean field 2 counties over from where he'd started it. 11 years of solo bookkeeping, solo planting decisions, solo arguments with implement dealers who assumed the man of the house would be along shortly to finish the conversation. 11 years of keeping that Case IH alive past any reasonable expectation, patching hydraulic lines, replacing seals, nursing a lift pump that had been weeping fluid since Clinton's first term. And then, 3 weeks before she needed it in the field for fall tillage and grain hauling both, the pump gave out entirely. Not a slow weep this time, but a catastrophic loss of pressure. The loader arms sagging dead in the yard like a broken wing, hydraulic fluid pooling black under the frame where the seals had finally surrendered after 4 decades of patient failure. The binder does not record what that moment felt like. It only records numbers, a dealer quote of $4,200 for a rebuilt hydraulic pump and associated repairs, underlined twice, hard enough that the pen had nearly torn the page. Beneath it, in smaller writing, as though she'd done the arithmetic more than once hoping for a different answer, can't. Not with fall bills. Not with seed corn due in March. The granddaughter sits with that page a long moment, feeling the cold coming up through the tractor's fender into her hands, understanding for the first time the shape of the trap her grandmother had been standing in. A woman alone on 1,100 acres, a dead tractor in the yard, planting season bearing down like weather on the horizon, and a bank account that could not absorb a repair bill 5 figures deep, without borrowing against ground that had never once in 56 years carried a mortgage past its second decade. She turns the page, already knowing, in the vague way family knowledge settles into bone, that whatever came next had started with a newspaper notice about a foreclosure sale on the county fairgrounds lot. The clipping itself is not in the binder, but the granddaughter finds its shadow, a date circled in red ballpoint on a free county calendar tacked to the shop wall, the kind co-ops used to give away every December with a photo of combines on the front. November, penned in her grandmother's tight cursive. Henderson Place, bank sale, fairgrounds, 10 a.m. Nothing more. No exclamation point, no underline, nothing to suggest that a woman staring down a $4,200 hydraulic quote she could not pay had circled a date the way a person circles a doctor's appointment they are dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The granddaughter knows enough of the county's memory to fill in what the calendar does not say, that the Henderson place, 3 miles east on the section road, had gone under that fall after 2 bad bean years and a balloon payment nobody talked about at the co-op counter, and that the bank had scheduled the equipment sale for the same week frost first killed the garden tomatoes, because banks do not wait for mercy in their timing. What the binder does preserve, in a separate section marked only budget, in block capital letters, is the arithmetic her grandmother had done at the kitchen table in the days before the sale. Grain contracts already committed, propane money set aside for the bins, a line for seed corn due in March that could not move, and at the bottom, boxed twice, the number that mattered, $2,000, and not a dollar more, because 2,000 was what existed, and everything past it existed only on paper the bank would have to sign. It was not a number chosen out of hope. It was chosen the way she chose everything, by subtraction, by what could not be spent because it had already been spoken for. The granddaughter understands, reading it, that her grandmother did not walk onto that fairgrounds lot as a gambler. She walked on as a woman who had kept every fuel receipt and every oil change record for the case for 11 years running, who had rebuilt a water pump herself in 1994 rather than pay the dealer's labor rate, who trusted her own hands and her own eyes over any quote written on a service counter's letterhead, because 30-some years of farming the same 1,100 acres had taught her that machines rarely lied, even when the men selling them did. The auction notice had listed 6 lots of equipment liquidated out of the Henderson estate, one line among them reading only JD 4440, condition unknown, sold as is. No hours listed, no photograph, just 4 words that would decide, within the week, whether the coming planting season had a tractor in it at all. The morning of the auction came in gray and windless, the kind of November cold that settles into the ground and stays there until March. The granddaughter has seen photographs from those years, not of that day specifically, but enough to build the scene in her mind as she reads. Pickup trucks backed into rows on frozen grass, breath fogging in front of idling diesel engines, men in canvas coats, standing in loose clusters, with coffee cups going cold in their hands. The fairgrounds lot in late autumn always smelled the same, she'd been told once. Hydraulic fluid and manure and the particular sharpness of cold metal, and that morning would have been no different, except for what waited at the end of the row. The 4440 sat last in the line, past the disc harrows and the culled cattle equipment, past a grain drill nobody wanted either. It was mud-colored under the frost, the green gone dull, one rear tire low enough to list the whole machine a few degrees to the left. It looked, by her grandmother's own later account, written in the margin of a feed store receipt tucked into the binder, like something that had already given up before anyone touched it. The auctioneer worked his way down the row with the practiced rhythm of a man who had sold 1,000 estates and felt nothing about any of them, until he reached the tractor and stopped rhythm altogether. He held up a hand, the way auctioneers do when they want a crowd's full attention rather than its money, and said the words that would follow that tractor, and her, for years afterward, cracked block, confirmed by the estate's own mechanic, sold as is, buyer beware, essentially scrap iron with a seat on it. The crowd's laughter was not cruel exactly. It was the low, easy laughter of men who agreed with each other before any of them had spoken, the sound of consensus forming without a single dissenting voice. Someone near the back said loud enough to carry that the bank ought to be paying people to haul it off, instead of asking money for it. Another voice suggested it made a fine planter for petunias. The auctioneer let the laughter run its course, because a laughing crowd was a crowd still listening, and then he opened the bidding anyway, because that was his job, cracked block or not, and somebody's paper still said it had to sell. The granddaughter pictures her grandmother standing apart from the main cluster, not laughing, her hands in her coat pockets, her eyes not on the auctioneer's face but on the tractor itself, on the pale trail she had already noted 2 days earlier during the pre-sale walkthrough. The dried mineral ghost of old coolant pooled low near the front of the block, in a pattern that did not match, not exactly, the way a cracked block usually wept. The granddaughter has heard this part of the story enough times that she can walk it herself now, the way her grandmother must have walked it that gray October morning 2 days before the sale, when the fairgrounds lot was still empty except for the bank's tagged machinery, and the frost still held the ruts in the gravel stiff. She pictures her kneeling, not standing, because that was always the difference between her grandmother and the men who circled these auctions. The men stood and looked, and her grandmother knelt and touched. She would have run her bare fingers along the block, casting first, feeling for the telltale ridge of a true fracture, the kind that opens under thermal stress and weeps coolant in a thin, continuous line, no matter how the machine sits, uphill or down, hot or cold. What she found instead, according to the binder's earliest page, was a stain that pooled, not streaked, not trailed in a single directional seep, but pooled, low and wide, at the front left corner of the block, the mineral crust built up in rings, like something that had dripped from one fixed point over a long stretch of idle time, rather than bled continuously from a stressed seam under running pressure. She would have pressed her thumbnail into the crust and found it flaked rather than adhered, old rather than fresh, meaning whatever had caused it had likely stopped being a problem, or had simply been ignored long enough to become one nobody bothered tracing back to its source. A cracked block does not usually forgive you that kind of pattern. A cracked block keeps talking, keeps leaking under any real load, keeps its story consistent no matter who is looking. What she was looking at instead had the shape of a single-point failure, isolated, low front left, which in her decades of turning wrenches on machines, just like this one, meant only a handful of components lived in that exact location, and most of them were cheap, replaceable, and entirely unrelated to the integrity of the block itself. She did not say any of this out loud at the sale barn, not to the auctioneer, not to the men clustered by the coffee urn discussing the tractor like a body already in the ground. She had learned long before that morning that a suspicion voiced too early only invited someone else to buy the correction for themselves, and she had no intention of financing another man's education with her own 2 days of careful, cold-fingered inspection. So she kept her hands in her coat pockets when the bidding opened, kept her face unreadable, kept the pale ghost of that coolant stain locked behind her eyes as a private ledger entry only she could read. And when the first bid came in low and mocking, she let it sit there in the air a moment longer before she raised her hand. The binder doesn't say what it felt like, standing in that crowd with her hand raised against the grain of everyone else's certainty, but the granddaughter can imagine it well enough from the way the pages themselves seem to brace against something, the ink pressed harder in places where the pen must have paused. $200, someone called out first, a neighbor 3 farms over who'd once borrowed her post-hole digger and never returned the auger bit. And it came with a laugh already built into it, the kind of laugh that assumes the joke has already landed. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a voice that had sold half the equipment in that county over 3 decades, repeated the number without much conviction, then added, unprompted, that he wouldn't take that block for scrap iron, let alone give it a home in a working shed. A ripple of agreement moved through the men by the coffee urn. Someone said something about paying to haul away a boat anchor. She didn't turn to look at any of them. She raised her hand at $2.50, and the crowd's laughter sharpened into something almost affectionate, the kind reserved for a woman everyone assumed was about to learn a hard lesson gently, in public, where it could be retold for years at the co-op counter. The auctioneer, perhaps out of some obligation to due diligence, asked her directly if she understood the tractor was being sold as is, no warranty, no guarantee of a working engine, practically for parts. She said she understood. He said it again, differently, the way a man repeats himself when he suspects the first version didn't take. She said she understood that too. Another bid came in at $300 from a farmer 2 townships over who dealt in scrap metal and probably intended to strip it for the transmission alone, and she let a beat pass, watching the coolant stain in her memory instead of the tractor sitting dead and dust-colored under the November light. And then she raised her hand again. $400. The room's mood shifted from amusement to something almost embarrassed on her behalf. A few men shaking their heads, one of them audibly muttering that some people never learn who's boss between a farmer and a diesel engine. The bidding crawled instead of ran now, the scrap dealer clearly unwilling to go much further on a corpse, and when she said $500, the auctioneer paused just long enough to look at her directly, not unkindly, more like a man checking whether a decision was final before he let it become permanent. She held his eyes. He called it once, twice, and the scrap dealer, who had already priced his margins down to nothing, shook his head and let it go. $600, going once, going twice, sold. To the woman everyone in that yard was already certain had just bought herself a very expensive lesson in humility, delivered in cast iron, parked crooked, and waiting for a trailer. I found the receipt from that day years later, tucked into the binder's back pocket behind a photograph of the freeze plug, and the number written on it in her small, upright hand still startles me every time I turn to it. $600, paid in full, cash, no financing, no paper trail through any bank that might have asked questions about a woman who'd just lost the use of her only working tractor, buying another one condemned as scrap. She told me once, years after, that the drive home that evening was the quietest hour she'd spent behind a wheel in a decade, the dead 4440 chained flat on a borrowed trailer behind her, and somewhere in that quiet, she'd started doing the arithmetic that any farmer does when there's no room left for error. $600 was not nothing on that operation in that year. It was diesel for 3 weeks of field work, or half a set of new tires for the grain cart, or the difference between paying the seed bill on time and paying it late with interest tacked on. And it was money spent on a machine that a man who sold dead equipment for a living had just called worthless to his own face, in front of a fairground full of witnesses. At the kitchen table that night, with the ledger open and the yard light throwing a long yellow rectangle across the linoleum, her husband asked her plainly what she planned to do if she was wrong, if the block truly was cracked the way the auctioneer said, if the coolant stain she'd read like scripture out in that cold lot turned out to be nothing more than a dying engine's last confession. She didn't have a clean answer for him. She only had the memory of where the residue had pooled, dried pale and mineral white with a faint green cast, gathered low near the front corner of the block, rather than trailing down from any crack line she could find, with a flashlight and her bare hand run along the casting. It was a detail, not a certainty, and she knew the difference. Planting season was 5 months out. The Case IH sat dead in the yard with its hydraulics bled dry, and there was no slack left in the budget to absorb a second mistake if this first one proved to be exactly what everyone at the auction believed it was. Her son, still in high school then, asked if they were going to lose the tractor money the way they'd lost money on the hydraulic pump the year before, and nobody at that table answered him right away. She has written, in pencil, in the margin of that same ledger page, "If I'm wrong, we're short until harvest. If I'm right, we're even by planting." No exclamation, no defense of herself, just the plain math of a woman who understood that being right and being able to prove it were two very different debts to settle before spring. The binder's next pages are grease fingerprinted at the corners, and I can tell by the pressure of the pencil that this was the part where she stopped writing like a woman defending a decision and started writing like a woman doing an autopsy. She dated each entry, morning and afternoon separate, the way a nurse charts vitals, because she told me once that a machine under diagnosis needs the same discipline as a patient. You don't guess, you observe, you record, and you let the record argue for you later when someone doubts your memory. The first entry says only, "Drained block, no antifreeze smell of burnt oil, no metal shavings in the pan." That absence mattered to her more than any single finding, because a cracked block running hot enough to fail usually leaves some trace of itself in the oil, some warning sign of coolant intrusion mixing where it shouldn't. She found none. She pulled the water pump next, then the thermostat housing, working backward along the coolant's path, the way you'd walk a fence line looking for the one post that's leaning. Each bolt she removed, she logged by size and torque, not out of vanity, but because she intended to put every one of them back exactly as it came out, and a woman with one tractor and no dealership credit line does not get to lose track of a single lock washer. The block casting itself, once she'd wire-brushed the grime and old grease from its surface, showed nothing, no hairline seam catching the light, no telltale rust bleed where a crack would have wept for years under pressure. She ran her palm over every inch of it slowly, the way she'd done at the auction lot, checking now with better light and no crowd of men waiting to see her fail. It was on the second afternoon, with the light going gray through the shop's single window, that she found the freeze plug on the block's left side sitting wrong in its bore, not punched through, not obviously blown, but crusted with a corrosion pattern that matched, almost exactly, the pale mineral trail she'd photographed pooling at the front corner days earlier. She wrote the observation down before she let herself feel anything about it, because she had trained herself, over 3 decades of keeping this same kind of ledger, not to trust a hunch until the ink had made it something closer to fact. The pencil marks here are steadier than the ones from the kitchen table, less urgent, the handwriting of someone circling closer to an answer rather than gambling on one. She underlined the word plug twice, and beside it, in the same hand, she had drawn a small, rough sketch of the corrosion's shape. Not for anyone else's benefit, I think, but because she needed to see it laid out plainly before she let herself believe what 30 years of experience were already telling her. I stand in the shed now with that same page open in my hands, and I can almost hear the particular quiet of that second afternoon. No wind through the eaves yet, no radio, just the small metallic sounds of someone working alone with a flashlight wedged against her shoulder. She would have knelt there a long while before she touched anything, the way the binder's photographs suggest, taking 3 separate pictures of the plug from 3 angles before she ever reached for a punch or a screwdriver to test how loose the metal had become. When she finally worked it free, it did not resist the way a healthy fitting should. It came away in pieces, the outer rim crumbling into a rust-colored powder that stained her glove, the center dropping into her palm already split along a seam that corrosion had been widening, invisibly, for years. She wrote the word confirmed on that page, and it is the only word in the entire binder underlined 3 times instead of 2, as if by then she had allowed herself that much certainty and no more. What she was looking at, she noted, was not a manufacturing flaw or a casting fault in the block itself, but neglect, plain, ordinary, entirely preventable neglect. The freeze plug, a $2 part pressed into the side of the block at the factory decades earlier, existed for exactly this purpose, to give way under pressure so the block itself never had to. It had done its job for years, and then, sometime in the tractor's later life, it had begun to fail slowly, weeping coolant along a path that gravity carried forward and down, exactly matching the pale trail she'd first photographed, pooling near the block's front corner. No one before her had thought to trace that stain back to its source. No one had pulled the plug, cleaned the bore, or asked whether a $2 part might explain what looked, at a glance, like a death sentence for the whole engine. The auctioneer's warning, the dealership's silence, the neighboring bids that dried up out of caution, all of it had rested on an assumption that turned out to be a misread, and she had the corroded metal in her palm now to prove it. She logged the part number from the shop manual beside her sketch, cross-referenced it against a parts catalog already dog-eared from years of other repairs, and calculated the cost of a full freeze plug set at just under $40, including gaskets. She did not celebrate. She simply turned the page, the way she always did, and began writing out the next set of steps, cleaning the bore, checking for pitting deep enough to compromise the seal, deciding whether the block could be trusted to hold a new plug at all, or whether 30 years of reading machines had led her, this time, to a mistake she would have to admit in her own hand. The bore came clean under her wire brush, and she found no pitting deep enough to worry her, only the ordinary roughness of 30-year-old iron that had simply done its job of holding metal against metal until neglect finally wore it through. She noted this too, in the small, cramped hand her granddaughter would later learn to recognize on every page of the binder. Pressure test held, no further corrosion detected, proceeding with replacement. As though the tractor itself had been given a clean bill of health after a long illness no one else had bothered to properly diagnose. She ordered the freeze plug set from the same parts counter where the dealership had once quoted her $11,000 for a Reman long block, and when the young man behind the register rang up $38 and change, he did not ask what it was for, and she did not tell him. Some corrections did not need an audience. She worked through gasket sets next, resealing the water pump housing and the thermostat cover. Not because either had failed, but because she had learned, over 3 decades of farming this same 1,100 acres, that a job done halfway was a job you would be doing again within the year, usually at the worst possible moment of the season. She flushed the cooling system twice, running clean water through until it ran clear, then filled it with a 50-50 mix. She mixed herself in a bucket rather than paying for the pre-diluted jugs. Another $2 saved that she wrote down anyway, because the binder did not distinguish between small mercies and large ones. It simply recorded them all, in order, the way a ledger recorded debts. When she finally turned the key, she did not do it with any ceremony. There was no one standing in the doorway of the shop to watch, no auctioneer to prove wrong in front of a crowd, only the cold quiet of a February evening and the particular hush of a building that had held its breath through worse winters than this one. The engine caught on the first turn, rough for half a second the way any engine will after sitting idle through a diagnosis, then settled into a steady, even rhythm that ran clean through the exhaust stack without so much as a wisp of the white smoke that would have told her the head gasket had failed along with everything else. She stood with one hand on the fender, feeling the vibration travel up through her palm the way she had felt it 1,000 times before on tractors that had never once been called dead, and let it run for 20 minutes by the clock on the wall, watching the temperature gauge climb and hold, refusing to spike the way a cracked block would have forced it to. Total cost, she wrote at the bottom of the page, underlining it twice, $962.40, including the $600 she had paid at auction for a tractor the whole county had already buried. The binder does not say much about what came after that night, not in words, but the pages themselves tell it. The handwriting changes from the tight, defensive print of a woman proving something to herself to something looser, more confident, the entries shorter because she no longer needed to convince the page of what she already knew. Hour meter readings logged every autumn like clockwork. 1,100, then 1,300, then 16, the numbers climbing steady across 8 harvests, while the 4440 pulled grain cart after grain cart down the same gravel lanes that had carried the Case IH before its hydraulics gave out. Before any of this began. There is a September entry, 3 years after the auction, that says only ran the cart all day, no drips, no smoke, cooler holding 195, same as June 6 words that meant more to her, standing in that shop, than anything the auctioneer had said into his microphone that November afternoon. Word moves slow in farm country, and then all at once, the way frost creeps across a windshield, until the whole pane goes white in a matter of seconds, and that was how her name changed in the mouths of the men who had laughed at the fairgrounds lot. It started with a neighbor 2 sections east, a man who had bought a scrapped baler off his own father's estate and could not get it to tie a bale to save his life. Driving up her lane on a Tuesday morning with the baler on a flatbed and a look on his face like a man asking a favor he was ashamed to need. She found the problem in an afternoon. A twine tension spring seated wrong, nothing more, and refused to take money for it, though he left $40 folded under a coffee can on her workbench anyway. Then it was a combine header somebody's cousin had written off as a total loss, then a skid steer with an electrical short 3 mechanics in town had given up chasing, then a grain drill, then another tractor, then enough machines that she started a second binder just to keep the names straight. She never advertised any of it. She never needed to. The same coffee shop that had gone quiet when she paid her $600 in cash now had men leaning over the counter asking whether she'd take a look at something before they hauled it to salvage, and she always answered the same way. In the same flat, unhurried voice her granddaughter would come to recognize as pure inheritance. "Bring it out? I'll tell you what it's worth once I've looked. Not before." The reputation that had once been a joke passed around a bidding crowd became, over those 8 seasons, something closer to a standing in the county, quiet, load-bearing, the kind that does not announce itself but simply holds, the way a good foundation holds a house nobody thinks to thank it for. The granddaughter stands there now in the last gray light, coming through the shed's west window, the binder open on her lap, the way it must have sat on a kitchen table 100 nights 30 years ago, and she does what she has been putting off doing since she pulled the cover back an hour ago. She turns to the last page. Taped there, flattened under a strip of yellowed packing tape gone brittle at the edges, is the freeze plug itself. Corroded, blown outward at its center, the metal gone thin and lace-like where the coolant had eaten through it year after year, while a man who owned the tractor before her grandmother ever touched it chose not to look. Beside it, pinned with a rusted paperclip that leaves a faint orange bloom on the paper beneath, is a torn quarter of cardstock with block-lettered auction lot handwriting. Scrap, cracked block, as is, no warranty. The auctioneer's tag, kept on purpose. Kept the way a person keeps a verdict overturned, not to gloat, but to remember exactly what she was up against, and exactly what it cost to prove it wrong. She does not laugh at it, and she does not cry either, though something in her chest tightens the way it does, standing in a place built by someone who is no longer in it. She thinks about the 8 seasons that tractor spent hauling grain carts under a harvest sky, the 8 winters it sat exactly here waiting for spring, the $600 that became less than $1,000 that became, in the only currency that mattered on 1,100 acres, a farm that kept running instead of one more debt stacked on top of a dead Case IH and a bank's polite refusal. She thinks, too, about the phone still ringing in the farmhouse kitchen some Tuesdays, a neighbor 2 sections over, a name she half recognizes from her grandmother's binder margins, asking if anyone out there still does what her grandmother used to do, looks at a machine before believing what it's been told it is. And she understands, closing the cover gently over the freeze plug and the tag and the coolant-stained photographs from another decade, that the answer to that question is standing in this shed right now, binder in hand, learning the second binder's names the way her grandmother once learned the first's. Outside, the tractor waits under its shop light, engine sound, paint worn to primer in patches, the freeze plug replaced long ago, and the one in her lap kept only as evidence of a $600 bid, a cracked block lie, and a woman who read the coolant trail correctly when everyone paid to know better had already looked away. The reputation was never the auction. It was this, the binder, the proof, the machine still standing.